Welcome to the HFY Codex Tale. If you like our videos, keep supporting and subscribe to our channel. Delivery day, 3 alien brides at his door. It was just after sunset when Jake heard the knock. He wasn't expecting anyone. No visitors, no deliveries, just silence in his small apartment like every other day. The knock came again, slow, heavy, almost unnatural. Jake stood up from the couch, heart beating faster. He walked to the door and opened it halfway. Then he froze. 3 women stood outside, not human. They looked almost human, close enough to pass if you weren't paying attention. But their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Their skin shimmered in strange patterns, and their clothes, tight, silver uniforms, had a government seal printed across the chest. One of them stepped forward. She was tall, elegant, with dark purple hair tied back. She bowed her head. "Citizen Jake Carter," she said in a calm, robotic voice. "We are your assigned wives, under the Unity Bride Act, Section 42. Jake blinked. "My what?" The second one, shorter, softer voice, stepped forward too. She held out a black box with a red fingerprint scanner. "Please confirm delivery. Your touch is required to finalize the bond." He didn't move. The third woman hadn't said a word. She stood at the back, arms crossed, silver eyes watching him like a hawk. She didn't bow, she didn't smile, she just stared. Jake looked around, expecting cameras, maybe someone filming a prank. This has to be a joke," he said. "I never signed up for this." The tall one answered, "You were selected at random. Earth is part of the Intergalactic Union. All males between 25 and 40 are eligible." Jake backed up. "No thanks, I don't want alien brides." The short one's face fell. "Please," she whispered. "We don't have anywhere else to go. You're our only legal assignment." The tall one added, "Refusal is not permitted. You must accept us. We are yours now." He stared at the box, at the red light blinking slowly. One touch would make this real. His heart said run, but something in their faces, especially the silence of the silver-eyed one, made him pause. "Why me?" he asked. The short one looked down. "Because you're human and kind." Jake hesitated, then slowly, carefully, he touched the scanner. Beep. The light turned green. The tall one smiled. "Bond complete. We are now your wives." Jake opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Come in," he said softly. They entered one by one. The short one bowed as she walked in, her long blue hair brushing the floor. "My name is Lynn." The tall one nodded. "I am Aura." The last one stopped in front of him. Her voice was cold. "I didn't choose this," she said. "But now I'm here. My name is Raltza. Don't give me orders unless you're ready for what comes next." Jake didn't know what that meant, but her eyes, they looked like someone who'd seen war. Inside, they looked around the small apartment like it was another planet. Lynn touched the couch gently. Ara looked at the wall calendar. Raltza didn't move, just stood near the window, watching the street. Jake poured a glass of water. "You want something to eat?" Lynn nodded quickly. "We can cook or clean or anything." "No," Jake said. "You don't have to do anything tonight. Just sit, rest." That confused them. All 3 froze. Raltza narrowed her eyes. "You're not like the others." Jake looked at her. "What others?" But she didn't answer. That night Jake didn't sleep much. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. 3 alien women were now his wives, assigned, delivered, no warning. He heard quiet voices in the next room, then silence. Around midnight, he got up to check on them. Lynn and Ara were curled on the floor together like scared children. No blankets, just their uniforms. Raltza stood by the door, still awake, eyes glowing faintly. "You don't even lock your doors," she whispered. Jake scratched his head. "Didn't think I needed to." She stepped closer. "You will. There are others watching. The program is not what it seems." "What do you mean?" he asked. But Raltza didn't answer. She walked past him and lay down on the floor beside the others, still fully dressed. Jake stood there, heart heavy. This wasn't just about marriage. Something deeper was going on. Something dangerous. And whatever it was, it had just begun. They obeyed his first command too well. Jake woke up to the smell of burning. His eyes flew open. Smoke was rising from the kitchen. He ran out, heart pounding. "What the?" Lynn stood in front of the stove, tears in her eyes, hands burned red. She had tried to cook eggs, but the heat was too high and she hadn't used oil. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You said you wanted food." "I didn't command you," Jake said, rushing to grab a towel and turn off the heat. "I thought you were hungry," Lynn said, voice shaking. "I just wanted to be useful." Before Jake could answer, Ara appeared, holding a plate with burnt toast and raw meat. "I did mine fast," she said with a proud smile. "Quick response to your request." Jake stared at her. "I didn't request anything." Then Raltza walked in silent. She dropped a tray on the floor, tea, fruit, and some broken kitchen tools. Jake looked at the mess. "Why did you destroy the blender?" Raltza folded her arms. "It was too loud, I didn't like it." Jake took a deep breath and looked at the three of them. "I never ordered you to do any of this," he said. Ara blinked, "But you asked about food." "Yeah," Jake said. "I was just being polite." They all looked confused. Raltza narrowed her eyes. "You don't understand what we were trained for." Jake helped Lynn sit on the couch and wrapped her hands in a cold cloth. "Tell me, then, what were you trained for?" Ara spoke first. "We were trained in Service Protocol 9 to obey fast, to predict your needs before you speak." Lynn added softly, "We got punished if we didn't move quickly enough or if the male got upset." Jake felt a chill down his spine. "Punished? You mean someone hurt you before?" They didn't speak, but their silence said enough. Raltz's voice was sharp. "This bride program is not about love, Jake. It's control, it's ownership. You don't command us now, but if you do, we must obey. That's the law." Jake sat down, shaken. "I didn't ask for this," he whispered. "We didn't either," Lynn said quietly. The room went quiet. The smoke had cleared, but the tension still hung in the air. Then slowly, Ara got up and knelt on the floor in front of Jake. "I don't care what the program says," she said. "If you want kindness, I want to learn it." Jake was surprised. "You don't have to kneel." Ara smiled faintly. "But I want to. This is my choice, not theirs." Raltza turned away and muttered, "Careful, Ara. You're starting to feel that's dangerous." Later that day, Jake called the program office. He spoke with a machine voice that only repeated laws and rules. "Brides are assigned by law. Emotional development is not monitored. Physical safety is not guaranteed." Jake hung up furious. That night he placed a blanket over Lynn and Ara as they slept. But Raltza stood outside on the balcony, staring at the stars. "Why don't you sleep?" he asked. "I don't like closing my eyes near strangers." Jake stood beside her. "You're not my property," he said. "I don't want slaves, I want people, real ones." Raltza didn't smile, but her eyes softened just a little. "Then you better be ready," she whispered, "because if we stop obeying, someone will come looking." Jake stared at her. "Who?" Raltza turned her head slowly. "The handlers, the ones who trained us." And for the first time, Jake realized he hadn't just accepted 3 brides. He had welcomed 3 weapons. And someone, somewhere, wanted them to stay obedient. The one bride who refused to obey. Jake had barely slept since that strange night. The memory of Raltza's cold words and defiant stare echoed in his mind. As morning light crept through the window, he found himself wondering which of his 3 brides would change and which would stay the same. It was then he noticed something different about Raltza. In the early hours, while Lynn and Ara whispered softly to each other as they prepared breakfast, Raltza remained silent. Instead of following the expected routine, she sat by the window, her dark eyes lost in thought. Her hands were folded on her lap, and she did not move when Jake entered the room. "Raltza," Jake said, his voice low and gentle, "are you all right?" For a moment she did not answer. Finally, she turned slowly, and the usual steely hardness in her eyes had softened just a bit. "I am not like the others," she said quietly, her voice firm but trembling with emotion. "I do not obey as they do." Jake frowned in confusion. "What do you mean? You were all trained to obey. We all follow the program." She shook her head, her dark hair falling over her shoulders. "The program makes us do things without thought, without feeling. But I feel something else. I feel anger and fear and hope. I cannot simply obey if it means losing myself." At that moment, the room grew quiet. Lynn and Ara exchanged worried glances. They knew the rules well. Disobedience was not allowed and was met with swift punishment. Yet Ralts's words stirred something in them, a spark that had been hidden deep inside. Days passed, and while Lin and Ara carried out every command with mechanical precision, Raltsa began to act in unexpected ways. When Jake asked her to set the table, she paused as if weighing the request against an inner conflict. Instead of rushing to follow orders, she took her time and looked at Jake, silently questioning him. Once, when asked to clean the living room, she stopped midway and placed a hand over her heart before finishing the task slowly, almost as if to protest the loss of her dignity. One afternoon, while Jake was out running errands, Raltsa sat in the living room watching the empty street. The soft hum of the city outside mixed with her deep thoughts. She recalled fragments of a past that she barely remembered, a life before the program, full of choice and freedom. In that quiet moment, she made a decision. She would no longer let the government control every move of her life. When Jake returned home that evening, he found Raltsa standing by the door. Her posture was strong and her gaze was steady. "Jake," she said, her voice low but clear, "I need to speak with you." They sat in the dim light of the living room. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Raltsa broke the quiet. "I have been trained to obey, to follow every command without question, but I cannot do that anymore. I feel alive when I think of making my own choices. I do not want to be a tool for the government, for anyone." Jake listened, feeling a mix of admiration and worry. "I know this is hard," he said slowly, "and I never wanted you to be hurt. I only wish we could all be free to be who we truly are." Raltsa's eyes glistened with determination. "I know the rules, Jake. I know that if I refuse to obey, there will be consequences. But I also know that if I do nothing, I lose a part of myself every day. I must find a way to live my life as my own." In that moment, the room felt charged with new energy. Though Jake was frightened of the unknown, he realized that Raltsa's defiance might be the key to breaking the program's strict control. He looked at her, then at Lin and Ara, who had quietly listened from the doorway. Each of them wore expressions of concern and curiosity. They, too, had felt the weight of their obedience and the cost it demanded. Later that night, while the others slept, Jake sat with Raltsa in a quiet corner of the small apartment. They spoke in hushed tones about freedom, choice, and the heavy hand of the government that had brought them together. Raltsa's voice trembled as she explained that deep down, she remembered a life before these orders, a life where a person could think and decide for themselves. "I want to know who I was before all of this," she admitted. "I want to know if I can be more than a bride sent by the government." Jake took her hand, feeling the warmth that contradicted the chill of his earlier fears. "Maybe together we can find that answer," he said softly. "Maybe we can help all of us learn to live as people instead of programs." Their conversation continued long into the night. Raltsa spoke of dreams and lost memories, while Jake shared his hopes for a life where love was not forced, but earned through trust and freedom. The bond between them began to change. It was no longer just an assignment dictated by law, it was becoming something genuine and real. But in the back of their minds, the threat of the program loomed large. The government would not easily allow such change. And even as hope flickered in the dark, both knew that the price of freedom might be steep. As dawn broke, casting soft light into the room, Raltsa made her choice clear. "I refuse to let fear bind me anymore," she said with quiet resolve. "Tomorrow I will begin to break the chains of obedience, even if it means defying everything." Jake looked at her, worry and hope mingling in his eyes. The road ahead was uncertain, and the cost of defiance could be harsh. But for the first time, they both understood that to be free, one must choose to fight for that freedom, even when the odds seem against them. He defended his brides, and the government noticed. Jake didn't think they were being watched. Not until the drone appeared. It hovered outside his apartment window one morning, silent and gray. At first, Jake thought it was just passing by, but it didn't move, it stayed. Lynn saw it first. She dropped the spoon in her hand and whispered, "They're watching." Raltsa walked over slowly, her eyes hard. "It's a behavioral compliance drone. They send it when a bond begins to break." Jake frowned. "Break? What are you talking about?" Ara stepped forward, her face pale. "Raltsa hasn't obeyed a single command in 2 days. That triggers a warning in the system." "But I haven't given her any orders," Jake said. "I told all of you you're free here." Raltsa looked at him. "That is the problem. Freedom is illegal in this program." Suddenly, a red light blinked on the drone. It scanned the room through the window. A voice crackled from a speaker on its side. Warning, emotional divergence detected. Recalibration required. Prepare for enforcement. Jake rushed to the window and shouted, "Get away from us. You don't control what happens in this home." The drone recorded every word. Then it buzzed higher and flew off. But it was too late. Jake had spoken against the program. That night the message came. A silver letter slid under the door. Raltza picked it up, opened it, and read aloud. Subject 3 marked for extraction due to resistance. Enforcement officers en route. Do not interfere. Aura gasped. Lynn covered her mouth. Jake stood frozen. "No," he said. "They can't take her." "They will," Raltza said calmly. "That's the rule. Disobedient units are either reprogrammed or erased." "Then I'll stop them," Jake said. Raltza looked at him. "You can't fight the system, Jake. You're just one man." Jake stepped forward. "You're not just units, you're people, and I'll fight for my people." When the knock came, it wasn't like before. It was loud, booming, angry. 2 officers stood outside, tall and dressed in black armor. Their faces were hidden behind glowing masks. One carried a thick control rod, the other held a transfer collar. Jake didn't open the door. He stood inside, his hand on the lock, heart pounding. Raltza stepped up behind him. "If you open it, they'll take me." Jake looked at her. "Then I won't open it." The door shook as the guards pounded harder. "Jake Carter," one of them barked, "you are interfering with a state operation. Subject 3 is marked for immediate extraction. Step aside." Jake didn't move. "No," he said, "she stays." There was silence. Then the door burst open. The guards stepped in, but they didn't expect what happened next. Aura grabbed the rod from the taller one and twisted it out of his hand with trained precision. Lynn, small and quick, kicked the other guard in the knee and knocked him down. Jake stared, shocked. "You know how to fight." Raltza smiled slightly. "We were trained for war before we were turned into wives." One of the guards reached for a weapon. Raltza kicked him across the face. He crumpled. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. Jake stood in the middle of the chaos, breathing hard. "They'll send more," Lynn whispered. Raltza nodded. "Now they know we're broken." "No," Jake said. "Now they know we're free." He looked at the women standing with him, his so-called assigned brides, but they weren't just that anymore. They were more. They had chosen him, and now he had chosen them. Outside, the drone hovered again. Its red light was blinking faster now. Inside, Jake made a decision. "We run," he said, "tonight." Raltza looked at him carefully. "You don't have to do this. You're still human. You could walk away." Jake looked back at her. "No," he said, "I don't walk away from my family." The drone beeped again and flew upward, disappearing into the clouds. But it had already sent the signal. And now they were fugitives. They came to take her back, but he fought. Rain fell quietly over the city. Jake stood in the dark packing a small bag with supplies. Food, water, medicine. He didn't know where they would go, but staying was no longer an option. The apartment was no longer safe. Lynn sat near the door, hugging her knees. "They won't stop, Jake," she said softly. "The government never gives up once it sends the retrieval squads." Aura moved quietly, checking the windows. "We have 12 hours, maybe less." Raltza didn't speak. She stood in the center of the room, staring at the collar left behind by the guard they had defeated. It blinked weakly, as if still trying to track her location. Jake looked at her. "I'll destroy it." But she shook her head. "No, we'll need it." Jake frowned. "Why would we need the very thing they used to control you?" Raltza finally turned to him. "Because they're not just coming for me now, they're coming for you too." Jake sighed and sat down. "Let them come." Raltza knelt in front of him, grabbing his arm. "You don't understand, Jake. These next ones won't be guards, they'll be handlers. They're stronger, smarter, and they don't ask questions." Jake looked at her face, at the way her hands trembled even though her voice was steady. She was scared, and that scared him more than anything. Later that night, they hid the signs of their escape. The drone hadn't returned yet, but they all knew it would. Just before dawn, the lock on the apartment door beeped. Jake's breath caught. They had overridden it. The door opened slowly. A woman stepped in. She wore a white coat and gloves that reached her elbows. Her face was calm, too calm. She spoke like a machine. Unit 3, return to control. Human resistance will be recorded. Behind her stood two more figures, tall, silent, their eyes glowing blue. Raltza stepped forward. I won't go. The woman nodded once. Resistance recorded, proceed. One of the glowing-eyed men moved fast, too fast. Jake leapt between him and Raltza. Bam, the hit landed hard. Jake flew into the wall, his shoulder crashing against the bookshelf. Books rained down, his vision blurred. Lynn screamed. Aura charged the second handler but was thrown aside like a rag doll. Raltza didn't run. She stood her ground. I am not your weapon anymore, she growled. The female handler raised her hand. A strange light sparked from her glove, reaching toward Raltza's collar. Raltza took a deep breath and then grabbed the collar herself. Jake shouted, no, don't. Too late. Raltza slammed the collar around her own neck and activated it. Beep, beep, click. The collar locked, but instead of falling to her knees like the handler expected, Raltza smiled. I rewired it, she said. It won't control me now, but it will shut you down. The collar pulsed. The glowing-eyed handlers froze mid-step. Then sparks burst from their heads, and both dropped to the floor like broken dolls. The female handler stepped back, eyes wide. That's not possible. Raltza stalked toward her. You made me a weapon, she said coldly. Now live with the results. Jake, still groaning from the hit, reached out. Raltza, stop. But Raltza didn't strike. She just stood over the handler, breathing hard. We could have followed the rules, she whispered. We tried, but you never wanted peace, you wanted control. The woman turned and ran. The apartment was filled with silence once again. Jake sat up, bleeding from his lip. Aura helped him stand. Lynn brought him water, her hands shaking. Raltza walked over slowly. You shouldn't have jumped in like that, she said. Jake smiled weakly. Too late to act like I'm smart. She looked at him for a long moment. You took a hit for me. No one ever done that. He shrugged. I told you, you're not property, you're family. Raltza turned away, but Jake caught a glimpse of something rare in her eyes. Tears. That night they didn't sleep. The government had sent their best and they had survived, but now they were on every list, marked, wanted. They couldn't stay in the city anymore. Where do we go? Lynn asked. Jake looked out the window at the rising sun. Somewhere they can't find us, he said. Somewhere we can choose who we are. Raltza stepped beside him. Then we run, not as brides, not as fugitives, but as people. And so the four of them disappeared, into a world that no longer welcomed them. But they were no longer afraid. Because they were no longer alone. Run or obey, the choice that changed everything. They found shelter in a small, abandoned outpost outside the city. The building was cold and silent, covered in dust and vines. No cameras, no drones, no signals. For now, they were safe. But only for now. Jake stood by the broken window, staring at the empty road. Lynn wrapped a blanket around herself. Aura sat close to a small fire she built from old furniture. Raltza didn't sit. She paced like a soldier preparing for war. They had been silent for hours. Then a strange sound echoed from Jake's pocket. Ping! His datapad blinked with a message, but it wasn't a normal one. Final warning. Return Subject 3 by midnight or face elimination protocol. Jake read it out loud. Lynn gasped, Aura's eyes widened. Raltza laughed bitterly. They finally said it out loud, she muttered. We don't belong to ourselves. We either run forever or submit and lose everything. Jake turned to her. There has to be another way. Raltza's voice dropped low. This is their final move. Either we obey or we die. Lynn clutched his arm. What do we do, Jake? Jake didn't answer right away. He looked at each of them, 3 alien women all trained to serve him, all slowly becoming something more. Not brides, not soldiers, but people. I'm tired of running, Aura said suddenly, but I'm more tired of pretending I'm someone I'm not. Jake walked into the center of the room. Then let's choose for ourselves. Choose what? Raltza asked. Jake looked her in the eyes. Who we are. He pulled out a small metal box he had taken from the last handler, something called a directive chip. It stored the core obedience programming for assigned brides. If destroyed, it would sever the government's control over them forever, but it came with a risk. If removed the wrong way, it could trigger a fail-safe shutdown, a permanent coma. I don't want to control any of you, Jake said. But this chip, if we destroy it, they'll never stop hunting us. If we keep it, they can still track you. Raltza stepped forward, then we destroy it. But Lynn whispered, what if it shuts us down? Raltza looked at her sisters. Then we take that risk, at least we'll choose it. Jake nodded. You don't have to do this alone. I'll stand with you no matter what happens. One by one, Lynn and Ara stepped closer. Raltza placed the chip on the stone floor. Jake raised a metal rod. His hands trembled. Are you sure? He asked one last time. Raltza answered first, yes. He slammed the rod down. Crack! The chip shattered into pieces. Sparks flew. The lights flickered, and all three women collapsed at once. No, Jake dropped to his knees. Lynn's breathing slowed. Ara's body twitched. Raltza didn't move. Jake shouted their names, held their hands, begged for them to wake up. But there was nothing but silence. Minutes passed, the fire burned low. Then Lynn stirred, her eyes opened. I feel, she whispered, clean. Ara gasped and sat up, breathing fast. It's gone, the pressure in my mind, it's gone. Jake turned to Raltza, still on the ground. He held her close. Come on, please, don't leave me now. Raltza's eyes slowly opened. She looked up at him and smiled. I'm still here, Jake. He laughed through his tears. She reached up and touched his face. You broke the system for us. No human would have done that. Jake held her hand. I'm not like most humans. She smiled wider. I know. Outside the broken outpost, clouds moved fast. A storm was coming. But inside, for the first time, they were free, truly free. No more chips. No more commands. No more pretending. Now they could live by their own choices, even if the whole galaxy was against them. We choose him, even if it breaks the law. The sky above the outpost turned red. Storm clouds swirled with strange lights. Distant sounds of engines echoed across the hills. The Union had found them. Inside, Jake checked the windows. Ara read the emergency map. Lynn held a small tracking device, now finally silent, and Raltza stood by the door holding a stolen plasma staff. They're coming, she said, and this time they'll bring more than drones. Jake clenched his jaw. How long do we have? Maybe 20 minutes, Ara answered, maybe less. Jake turned to the three alien women who were once assigned to him like property. Now they stood as free beings, brides no longer by law but by choice. I can surrender, Jake said. If they take me, they might leave you alone. No, Lynn said, stepping forward. We won't let them take you. They only care because we chose you, Ara added. They're afraid of real choice. Raltza's voice was firm. You don't understand, Jake. If we fight, we break the unity law forever. The system won't just erase us. It'll erase you too. Jake stepped forward. Then break it, break all of it. The sound of thunder shook the walls, but it wasn't thunder. Dropships were landing. Armed enforcers surrounded the old outpost. Then a voice boomed from the sky, calm and cruel. Surrender the human. Return the assets. Obedience will be rewarded. Resistance will be erased. Jake opened the door and stepped outside. The wind whipped his hair. Lights from the dropships lit the whole hill. A giant screen flickered on one of the ships, showing the face of a Union commander. Jake Carter, the voice said coldly. You were never meant to keep them. Return the brides now. Jake raised his voice. They were never yours to give. The screen flickered. Behind Jake, the three women stepped out, shoulder to shoulder, heads high. Raltza stared straight at the ship. We are not property. Ara lifted her hand. We were trained to obey. Lynn stepped forward, smiling, but we chose love. The soldiers raised their weapons. Jake held up his hands. If you want me, take me, but you leave them alone. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The screen blinked. A new voice came through, a human voice. Stand down, it said. This is Captain Myra of Earth Resistance Command. We see what's happening, and we're done being quiet. Another dropship flew over the ridge, this one with an Earth flag. Then another and another. Human voices came from radios across the hillside. We support voluntary bonds. No more forced obedience. Let the alien brides speak. The Union ships hesitated. Inside the command ship, someone shouted, "Sir, the humans are interfering. If we attack now, we risk a war." On the hill, Routza stepped forward, her voice clear. "I am not his wife because of law," she said. "I am his because I choose him." She looked at Jake, eyes soft but fierce. "We all do." Jake's heart pounded. They weren't just choosing to stay. They were declaring war on everything the galaxy believed about obedience. And they did it with love. The Union commander made one last threat, but then he turned off the screen. The ships pulled back. One by one, they vanished into the clouds. And the storm passed. Silence returned to the hilltop. Jake stood with his 3 alien brides, no longer assigned, no longer owned. Chosen, free, together. In a galaxy ruled by control, 3 alien women made a dangerous choice. They chose a human, and together they broke the law, to build something greater than any program ever could. Love, freedom, and the right to say, "We are not yours, we are his because we choose him."